My name is Irene Rodriguez, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's program entitled Education and Excellence, Our Keys to the Future. We have a wonderful program for you today, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you our director, Larry Westfall, who will introduce the guest speaker. Mr. Westfall, as many of you know, has just returned from a special project he has been working on for the past couple of months. We are happy to have him back in the center with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our director, Larry Westfall.
Thank you very much, Irene. I will assure you that you are not half as glad to have me back as I am to be here. There's nothing like being in Washington except being out of Washington and back in Austin, Texas. So it is really great to be back in the center and see everything here working like it is. I have made the comment to the staff that it's a little concerning to me that in my absence, the performance of the center actually improved. And I don't know exactly what that means. I think it means that I had just built such a head of steam that everything rolled on in my absence. Probably not. It's attributable to all of you. Well, welcome to our special program for Hispanic Heritage Week. We are privileged today to have Mr. Cristobal Aldrete as our guest speaker. Mr. Aldrete was born and raised in Del Rio, Texas. He is presently the Executive Assistant and Counsel to State Senator Santi Esteban of El Paso. Mr. Aldrete attended the University of Texas at Austin, began practicing law here in Texas in 1951. Served as a city council member and city attorney in Del Rio, as well as county attorney for Aldrete County. Was the political advisor on Hispanic political affairs to President Lyndon Johnson during the 60s and subsequently to Vice President Humphrey. And needless to say, in connection with these and other career-related issues, has spent much of the last several years in Washington, D.C. He served as Senator Lloyd Benson's executive assistant, and in 1977, President Carter appointed Mr. Aldrete to be the federal co-chairperson of the newly created Southwest Border Regional Commission, consisting of the governors of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. With the rank of Assistant Secretary of Commerce, he helped develop and implement a $10 million economic development program along the U.S. side of the southern border, one that I'm sure you're familiar with. Also initiated and sponsored the first United States-Mexico bilateral conference of governors, establishing a new level of communications to act on state and federal border issues and problems. As co-chairperson of the Border Working Group of the U.S.-Mexico Consultative Mechanism, he also developed policies and procedures for international bridges and crossings. Mr. Aldrete served as executive director of the Texas Senate Hispanic Caucus prior to his current retired and also remaining active situation. And these are just a few of his many accomplishments. I would like to take a 5-second interruption here and also acknowledge that he has with him today his son James, and we are grateful for his presence this afternoon. Mr. Aldrete, would you please come forward and would you please help me in greeting him?
My son James is a communications major, is working on his master's at the university, and is the only one that followed his father's career in politics, so he wants to see how the boss does it. Being here today reminds me of my law office, where we always, lawyers, have a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And I had a lady there with a restless child one day and kept tugging on her, says, "Mama, mire el viejo barbón. Mama, mama, look at the bearded old man." And she replied, "Yes, my son, it's Abraham Lincoln. For him, they named the Lincoln tax." Well, so much for that one. This year's topic is 500 years of Hispanic heritage. And it connotes that education and excellence are the keys to our future. Now, in order to get a better picture of where we are going and to better gauge our goals and objectives, I feel it necessary to go back into history and review where we were, what we went through, and where we are now. So we can start off with the history and say that our Hispanic ancestors made history, truly, for they discovered a new world. They were the conquistadores who braved many unknown situations and suffered many deprivations, but eventually founded a new civilization, a new race of peoples that was formed by the blending of the European and the various indigenous tribes here in the New World. Un nuevo mundo, an unparalleled feat that changed the world. Now, who were these brave souls? But before I tell you who these brave souls were, I'm reminded of a congressional race in San Antonio in 1957, when Henry Barbosa Gonzalez, the Democratic nominee, was opposed by a Jesse Oppenheimer on the Republican side. And Mr. Oppenheimer made the bravado statement that he could trace his ancestors over 100 years to the first German settlers of Central Texas in 1840. But whereas the Gonzalez family, who came in the early 1900s from Mexico, were relatively newcomers. Well, Henry B. Gonzalez, who's now our congressman in the 20th district and been there for quite some time, is not one to leave things undone. So he came back and retorted, mimicking his opponent and criticizing him and so forth. He said, "My friends, to the contrary, I can trace my ancestors many years farther back than my worthy opponent can. Why, half of my ancestors came on the Santa Maria de Niña de Pinta, and the other half were here on the shore waiting for him." I think in this respect, when we ask the question, who were these brave souls, the late Dr. George Isidore Sanchez, my mentor, who was chairman of the Department of History and Philosophy Education here at UT, described our pioneers' ancestors as follows. These colonial Hispanos were not culturally homogeneous. The Nuevo Mexicanos, having arrived in the region as early as 1598, were different from their cousins, the Californios and the Tejanos, who arrived much later. The date of migration and settlement, with all its cultural differences, geographic isolation, material and natural resources, the number and kind of Indians among whom they settled, and many such factors, resulted in not one Spanish-speaking people, but several, each with distinctive cultural personalities. The outlook on life and the scheme of values, the allegiances, the biology, the physiognomy, and the very speech of these colonial settlers varied greatly. And though all were Spanish-speaking, they can be thought as different peoples. And I think apropos to that, and the opinion and attitude that some people have, can be very well verified from that history. In the late 1940s, when I was here in law school, I used to go to San Angelo out in West Texas and manage a family grocery store during the summer. And one day, the three of us employees, the butcher, Felix Castillo, who was short and dark complexion, jet black hair, Popo Acosta, who was olive complexion, aperlado, as we say, and yours truly, and you'll see what I look like. All three of us went to see Dr. Van der Stucken. And we had to get our medical exam first. Asked us three questions. Have you had VD, TB, or been in the loony house? No, no, no. Okay, you're healthy. So from then we went to the city hall, and I started to bring this up to the attention of the clerk, that it was rather odd that the doctor had classified me as Spanish American, Popo Acosta, the olive complexion fellow, as Latin American, and the butcher, Felix Castillo, who's dark complexion, as Mexican American. She said, "Oh, that's the way these crazy doctors do it here in Angelo. We mark them all white." So anyway, I got back to the store and I related the incident to my brother-in-law, and he said, "Mira que doctor Hijo tal," and so forth. So I went ahead and called the doctor, and I said, "Doctor, this is Chris Aldrete from Figueroa Food Market number 2, and I was just there and so forth, and I just want to bring to your attention what caught my eye, and that's the racial classification. Oh yes, you see, we doctors here in Angelo have this custom and policy that the Spanish American is tall, light complexion, has usually green or blue eyes. The Mexican American is short and fat and dark, and the Latin American's in between." So I asked him, I said, "Well, I noticed that you went to UT in Galveston." He says, "That's true." I said, "Well, is that what they taught you there?" "I don't think that that's what they taught you there." So he thanked me for telling him how to run his business, and I told him I was mighty obliged. But beyond these differences that I related a while ago, we Tejanos had an entirely different history than our brother Californios or the Nuevo Mexicanos. First, we in Texas went through a difficult war of independence against Mexico in 1836. And the Anglos forgot that many of our Tejano ancestors fought inside the Alamo, fought against dictator Santa Anna, for shortly after the defeat of Santa Anna and the beginning of the Texas Republic, Tejanos were viewed with great distrust. Now remember that New Mexico remained culturally and racially isolated, and so did most of the Hispanic settlements in California. But Texas, to the contrary, had a land bridge with Mexico for the continued flow and infusion of more and more and more immigrants from Mexico. And this continued to retard our assimilation. And this continued to add to our problems. These Texas Mexicans were constantly harassed and persecuted by Anglos who sought revenge against all those viewed as enemies of the Texas independence. You remember that Juan Seguin, Lorenzo de Zavala, many of our great public office holders and many of our great ranchers and so forth had to flee to Mexico or Louisiana. Louisiana preferably, since they were considered traitors by Mexico. Their lands were stolen. They were deprived of their lands by various subterfuges and so forth. And as war between the United States and Mexico in 1846 appeared imminent, hostilities between Anglos and Tejanos increased. In many local communities, the Anglos demanded the banishment of Mexicans from Texan territory. And if unsuccessful, they formed vigilante committees and forced them to leave their homes under threat of violence. Many lost their lands through sheriff's lawsuits, fictitious lawsuits, sheriff's sales, and so forth. Despised by Anglos, the Mexican population rapidly became outcast in their own country. And this antagonistic feeling in that historical time can best be described by a song of the Texas Rangers around 1910. It went like this: "Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie, where the wild coyotes will howl over me, in a narrow grave just 6 by 3, where all the Mexicans ought to be." Well, that was the way the Texas Rangers felt. On the other hand, Jacinto Trevino, the famous nemesis of the Rangers, composed a corrido, a ballad, dedicated to the Rinches that translated to this effect: "Come on, you cowardly Rangers, no babies up again you. You want to meet your daddy? I am Jacinto Trevino. Come on, you treacherous Rangers, come get a taste of my lead. Or did you think it was ham between 2 slices of bread?" Well, so much for that. So there was humor in hatred. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 through 1920 and World War I combined to bring many thousands more Mexican immigrants to the Southwest. Large numbers came as displaced persons driven across the border by the fortunes of a chaotic civil war. And even larger numbers came as contract laborers, recruited by the trainload to work the beet fields of Colorado, the gardens and groves of California, the railroads of the entire West, the copper mines of Arizona, the cotton fields of Texas, the iron works of Chicago, the coal mines of West Virginia, and even the marble quarries of Tennessee and Kentucky. Looking back in history, Dr. Sanchez describes this free and easy dipping into the cheap labor reservoir that was and is Mexico as, quote, acute cultural indigestion, unquote. It was this modern foreign society of the 1920s and 30s the large-scale immigration of farm settlers that came from the Midwestern states to develop South Texas, that came from the South also into our ranching countries. And this is what began the sad chapter of race segregation. Then the competition of World War I and much better wages and conditions in the Midwest threatened Texas farmers with the possible loss of their Mexican labor pool in the late 1920s. Now, you must remember that at that period in time, Texas was a very much agricultural society and booming. They rallied and proposed a solution to the Mexican labor mobility problem, and a set of repressive bills designed to restrain Mexicans from leaving the state was introduced and passed in 1929 by the Texas legislature. And you must remember also, in the historical context, that our state legislature at that time was controlled by rural folk, by these same growers. These are the same people that put into our state constitution prohibition against the urban counties that couldn't have more than 2 state representatives. The repression consisted of vagrancy laws, local pass systems, manipulation of labor contracts, and labor agency laws to regulate the movement of Mexican foreign workers. This sort of reminds you of the apartheid system over there in South Africa. These controls, however, were repeatedly challenged and defeated in court by the competing Midwest agribusiness. Nevertheless, such labor controls set the context for a striking segregation of the races. In this period, the Mexicans became an inferior people, a community encircled and regulated by a Jim Crow policy. In the political arena, Tejanos quickly lost the few elected positions they held. A variety of legal and quasi-legal methods, as well as the use of organized force, especially the United States military and the Texas Rangers, were utilized to suppress potential Mexican political activity in these areas. Freed by the courts to migrate, and as the thousands of farm laborers began migrating to the Midwest, a corrido, a ballad, depicting their dire situation in Texas became quite popular and was heard in every cantina's jukebox. And one translated version in English, which I read, didn't particularly hit the right chord with me. And it said in English, "Goodbye, state of Texas, with all your fields. I leave your land so I won't have to pick cotton." That generally was the feeling by the migrant farm laborers. But the way I heard it in Spanish, it went like this. Adiós, mi valle querido, de tus bellas tierras yo me alejo. Me voy porque estoy bien jodido, y si vuelvo es porque soy pendejo. This is the problem about my bilingual humor. Now let us go in to see what the educational opportunities were that were accorded us. Whenever possible, Tejano parents sent their children to the local public schools, but they had to go through great personal hardships to do so. Because of their poverty and lack of political influence, Tejano parents had to contend with indifference and antipathy of local school officials, who in many cases failed to provide educational opportunities to the Texas Mexicans. And because of racial prejudice, these children either were systematically denied facilities or else provided with limited and inferior educational provisions with poorly trained teachers. There were 2 major sets of explanations for the pattern of underachievement of the Mexican-American school child. And one of these argued that Tejanos had lower intelligence and that achievement test scores proved that they were racially or culturally inferior. The other interpretation attributed the pattern of underachievement to non-hereditary factors. Prominent among those were language difficulties, poverty, migratory labor patterns, inferior educational opportunities, and most important of all, the prejudice toward this population by Anglo school officials. The debate over the relative influence of nature versus nurture on intelligence, which was to resurface in the coming years, was not resolved, but the racial arguments gained prominence over the socio-economic ones. The picture painted by the reports on education of the Mexican-American children during the 20s and early 1930s indicated the extent to which the Anglos dominated the decision-making structures of public education and controlled the conduct of the public schools. The Tejano population, as well as the prejudiced Anglos toward them, assured their continued exclusion from denial of equal public education. Now, what happened to us during the great economic depression of the 1930s? As always, in a bad situation, it's time to look for scapegoats. The United States repatriated thousands of Mexicans back to Mexico who were here, the majority since World War I, that we invited to come over there and help us with our labor shortage. It was also, at that time, looking for a scapegoat, that the Anglos felt that the Mexicans were holding them back in the public educational school system. This is the time of the Lemon Grove case in California. This is the time of the Del Rio Independent School District versus Salvatierra case, of which I am a victim. In 1930, I was my first year in the first grade, and my father was a party plaintiff, and this is when they segregated us. We grew up bilingually, but nevertheless, we weren't given any test whether we spoke English or not, or knew any English or not. If you were Spanish surname, automatically you went to the West End Elementary School. And in that case, which we won on the local level, but lost in the appeals in San Antonio, the court directed that Spanish-speaking children were deficient in the English language and could be given separate classroom instruction in the first two grades. Well, you know what happened since then. Automatically, that opened up a Pandora's box, and I ended up going segregated for 6 years, not 2 years, and not in separate classrooms. And many school districts ended up with a 12-year complete segregated system. In some counties, you couldn't go beyond the 6th grade. You had to go another county, just like the blacks during the old days of Jim Crow. Had to go another county to get a high school education. The fallacy of this legal notion was challenged by Dr. Sanchez, who argued that if Mexican-American children alleged to be deficient in the English language were grouped homogeneously with their own, with Spanish-speaking children, then how in the world are they going to learn English from each other? Knowledge is gained by the process of osmosis and environmental exposures, because just like animals, we ape, we mimic, we affect. And that is how many of us got bad English with accents and so forth, with expressions like, did you go to church to hear the preacher? You know. Dr. Sanchez said that if our children are going to learn English, then we must have all of these children, both Anglo and Hispanic, together in the same classroom facilities so that they can learn from each other. He went a step further and argued that if a Mexican-American student were tested and found deficient in the English language, there was no reason to segregate him from math, from music, from art, cafeteria, or recreation. For the learning process transcends the classroom. And ironically, this was the same argument that Thurgood Marshall, now in the Supreme Court, when he was general counsel to the NAACP, was the same argument that he used in the Heman Marion Sweat case here in Austin when the state of Texas built a separate law school for Heman Marion Sweat. And so we litigated our way through these anti-Mexican barriers. From the Mexican-American community, the end of Second World War did not signify a return to normalcy. Rather, it signaled the beginning of a new era in the struggle for equality. The post-war era was a period of renewed organizational development and resurgence within the Mexican community. Existing organizations replenished with stronger, more aggressive leaders, and new organizations were founded to fight for rights long denied the Mexican-American community. The American GI Forum, founded after World War II, of which I was one of the charter members, joined LULAC in many a legal battle in quest for school integration. A variety of strategies and tactics were used to gain access to the public schools and to seek equal treatment in our society. In the area of education, Mexican Americans conducted boycotts, numerous boycotts, to protest segregated schools and dilapidated and unsanitary facilities, hand-me-down books, separate seating assignments, segregated graduation. I went through that in the promotion of junior high school to senior high school. All the Anglos filed in first and sat in the first rows, and all the Mexicans came in at the end and sat in the back. So I was ready when I was graduating from high school. But fortunately, the student body voted on that, and they said, girls first by height, and then boys. So that resolved that situation. And one of the interesting things in some of these boycotts were like in Crystal City, where in many other places you had all Anglo football teams, no Mexicans allowed, and all Anglo cheerleaders, and you had to, your grandmother must have been a member 3 generations back in order you to be a cheerleader. And these girls had signs as brown legs are beautiful too. Well, anyway. And so we continued our fight. Now the question now comes into when did the change came? The urbanization of the state of Texas was the demise of segregation. We must remember that the segregated order was based ultimately on the political influence of the farmers, of the great agricultural enterprises, and herein lay the weakness of segregation in Texas. Already by World War II, growers had begun to give way to urban commercial interests as social and political force in Texas. And agribusiness itself gradually became urbanized as resident farm ownership passed into corporate hands. The bottom layer of the segregated order also collapsed as farm workers immigrated to the cities or to the fields of other states, especially the Midwest. The campaign against school segregation was prolonged for over 11 years, and I fought many of these cases. It was a war of attrition. After the Mendez versus Westminster case in California, we in Texas followed suit right here in this neighborhood with the Delgado versus Bastrop case, where Senator Gonzalo Barrientos was one of the students at that time. And then it was round after round with the Attorney General, at that time Price Daniel, the State Board of Education, and the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. It was back and forth. The State Board did not like us. It issued policies against school segregation based on race, which was a fallacy, but permitted segregated classes based on English language deficiency. And then they also passed another policy that we had to start over there with the local school board and only to the State Board on appeal. Well, let me tell you what that created. It created more and more delay. In Carrizo Springs, they had not replied to my letter requesting a hearing before the school board for 2 months. So I went over there one day, and I called on the phone there from downtown to 5 of the board members, and they all said they would not give me a hearing, and I could go to hell, and I could go to court if I wanted to. Fine. So when I went to see the superintendent, he'd already gotten word of my telephone calls, and he told me this: Mr. Aldrete, I want you to know that your presence in this community is not welcome. And frankly, based on the comments I've heard on the phone this morning, I fear for your safety. And if I were you, I'd get the hell out of town as quickly as possible. I told him that in my religion, we were taught that death was inevitable. But if some misguided mortal wanted to accelerate my departure, I was ready to take care of myself. I did not tell him that I carried a automatic pistol in my briefcase, just to back up the rosary. But anyway, we come down to the conclusion and to one of the topics today, that education is a key. And education is also a key to political attainment. For voter participation is directly related to educational attainment, to occupational status and income level. And that is a generally acknowledged finding in political science. The fact that Hispanics as a group are undereducated may go a long way toward explaining their low voter participation rates. Tom Weicker, of the New York Times columnist, in an article during the last presidential race entitled "Hispanics Crucial to Electoral Win," stated that voter participation tends to be the lowest among Americans not economically advantaged and with low educational levels. A description, he says, that fits many Hispanics when only 51% of Hispanics have finished high school. But let me tell you a little something interesting about when we started moving in the political arena in the late 50s and early 60s. When PASO, the Political Association of Spanish-speaking organizations, and Teamsters went to work, especially in Crystal City, Zavala County. There you had 80% of the population, if not more, Mexican American. But with one fluke exception, all the public offices were held by Anglos. So the problem, of course, was that the majority of this in Zavala County was home-based migrants. So they were away up north in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan, or Illinois during the time of the primaries, the time of the municipal elections, during the time of the school board elections. But anyway, what these two organizations did, the Teamsters Union and PASO, is that they had a tremendous voter registration drive and then hired notaries public up in those states and had a tremendous absentee voting system. The city council consisted of 9 aldermen, 8 Anglos and 1 TT, one token taco. And this was overturned in this particular election. I was en route from Del Rio to Laredo to federal court, and I was on the bus. And there at Carrizo Springs, which is the junction from Crystal City, I was the only passenger. This tall Mexican man came in, and he, being human nature, being gregarious, he sat right across from me. And pale as I am, he thought I was an Anglo, so he started a conversation with me in English. He said, "You know Juan Cornejo in Crystal City?" I said, "No, what does he do?" "He's a very important man. He has a very important job." "Well, what is it?" "What do you call the she-horse?" I said, "The mayor." "That's what he is. He's the mayor of Crystal City." Now, prior to 1960, getting back on the political situation, prior to 1960, the slow growth of Hispanic affluence and educational attainment was well mirrored in politics and in representation in the government bureaucracies. However, beginning with President Kennedy, our numbers and roles suddenly began to change and grow. But it was Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society that brought us to the nation's fore. The Great Society's programs of Head Start and community action opened the doors to the people of the barrios to begin grassroots community organization and become a political force to be reckoned with. When Mexican-American ballots nailed down Texas' 26 electoral votes for Jimmy Carter in '76, he reciprocated by appointing more Hispanics to federal positions than any of his predecessors, Republican or Democrat. Now, what are the issues that Hispanics identify with? Elected officials, we know, by the nature of their office, are key players in the public policy process. It is therefore relevant to see how Hispanic elected officials rank the importance of issues facing the Hispanic community. Clearly, the issue of transcendent importance is education. And interestingly, it is higher education that ranks as the greatest problem in the Hispanic community. Annually, it's encouraging to note that our enrollment figures are growing and increasing at all levels, but peculiarly or significantly in the community college level, but also in the university level. From '88 to '89, the increase has averaged annually about 8 to 9%, which is very promising for the future. Jaime Escalante, the popular math teacher at Garfield High School in East LA, and well-known for the movie Stand Up and Deliver, recently wrote in a column, Hispanic Link, on the future education of the Hispanic. And he said, "The children of the barrio have enormous obstacles to overcome in order to get an education. Students, however, can learn to overcome any barriers they will ever face. Ganas is all they need. Ganas means desire. It suggests a powerful urge to get ahead, a willingness to sacrifice and work hard, and ganas is a desire that must emerge from within. And ganas, he tells his students, conquers all so that the power of their dreams can overcome all barriers. But ganas requires a team effort. Parents, friends, religious leaders, school administrators, and teachers must all become involved." And so, going back to the history, we founded, we conquered, we created, we established. But unfortunately, as time went by and historical events affected us, we ourselves were vanquished, humiliated and subjugated, discriminated and segregated. But through the grace of God, perseverance, dedication, and an undying determination in pursuit of equality, of justice and educational opportunities, we overcame. And we defeated many a pernicious legal barrier. And until many of those wrongs that were directed against us were redressed. And to this day, we continue in our quest in pursuit of happiness and a better tomorrow. There's an old Spanish proverb, un refrán de antaño que dice, no hay mal que por bien no venga. Something good sometimes comes out of evil. And although this antagonistic past is behind us, we cannot rest on our laurels. We open the doors. Now we need to lead our folks through those doors. We need to fight harder for our rightful place in the sun. We cannot rest content with mediocrity. We need to reach out to the upper level. We have the qualified people for such, but in order to attain those goals, we need to help each other up that ladder to greater success. En la unión está la fuerza. In unity, there is strength. Thank you very much. I'd like to add just one additional serious, humorous remark, that as we move up, we've got to do it right, we've got to do it professionally, and not winging it or playing it by ear. And I'm reminded of a Mexican-American was from San Antonio that was stationed with the Air Force in Spain,